Okay, so good afternoon and welcome everybody to the workshop on planning for extended electrical outages. My name is Sarah Holstead. I'm the Hospital Library Services Program Manager at Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. And so thank you for joining us today. You're all entering the meeting room muted and with camera off, but you can interact via chat with comments and questions for the presenter. The chat feature is at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. If you do turn your video on now during the intro, please consider turning it off during the presentation because this will help with bandwidth for everybody. I'll be monitoring the chat, so message me directly if you have a technical issue. At this time, I'd invite you to say hello in the chat, say where you are in the world, and just introduce yourselves. In a moment, I'm going to turn the workshop over to our presenter, who is Tim Hayes from Central Hudson. Before we begin, I want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded. What you type into the chat will not be recorded with the video, and we trust that you'll be courteous and respectful to other attendees and follow the Southeastern Code of Conduct. Anyone who uses the chat in an abusive or threatening way will be removed from this webinar. This presentation is being live captioned using otter.ai. You can see a link to it at the top of your screen. If you click on the link, a new screen will open in your browser. You can resize your Zoom window and the browser window side by side to see the captions in real time. We do not have the capability to show captions directly in the Zoom window at this time. If you have trouble getting the captions to work, private message Carolyn or me in the chat. The presentation slides are posted on the workshop website right now, and the recording will be available soon. I'll drop the URL of today's workshop into the chat in just a minute. I already dropped it there once. And we'll also have CE certificates available upon request. I'll drop a link to the CE request form and to the course evaluation in the chat at the end of the webinar. So planning for extended electrical outages is the third in a series of workshops that will take place over the next few months about planning for emergencies in your library and community before they happen. As we saw in August with Hurricane Isaias, and as recently as last Monday, with a windstorm in our part of the Hudson Valley, electrical outages can happen in any season. This is why I'm excited to have Tim Hayes speak with us today. He's the Senior Director of Emergency Preparedness with Central Hudson. Hey, Tim. I'd like to call your attention to some upcoming events in the series that you can see on the slide. The Disaster Planning Working Group will meet next Tuesday, November 17th from 11 to 12. We'll be going through part of the Continuity of Operations Plan worksheet and also the self-care planning worksheets from the second workshop. You didn't have to attend the workshops to come to this meeting, and you can email me if you're interested in joining us. The next workshop in the series will address planning for public health emergencies in your library, aside from the pandemic, and I'm still working on a date for that. Finally, through this grant, we're offering a free online course developed by the National Library of Medicine and the Medical Library Association to earn a disaster information specialization certificate. If you have questions about any of this, please get in touch with me. In a minute, again, I'll drop the workshop URL into the chat. This workshop series is funded with a grant from the National Library of Medicine, and I'd like to acknowledge their support. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material did not necessarily reflect the views of the National Library of Medicine or the National Institutes of Health. I'd also like to acknowledge the Southeastern staff who are here today helping behind the scenes. Carolyn Bennett-Glauda and Moshe Siegel. Thanks, guys. So next slide, please. We started planning for these workshops back in February, ages ago, in response to events that we saw happening at libraries in the Southeastern region. This was not a response to the pandemic, but as we've seen over the past few months, natural disasters haven't been put on hold for the pandemic. Even without a major weather event, closing and reopening libraries in the middle of a pandemic brings whole other layers of stress. The way we experience emergencies or disasters or daily pandemic life is deeply personal, and the trauma can be life-altering. I just want to acknowledge the experiences that you all may be bringing to this workshop and ask that as speakers and commenters and listeners, we respect the narratives that may be shared today. One focus of these workshops is to help libraries make plans before an emergency or disaster, and also to help libraries get planning resources out to their communities so they can be prepared too. I want to take a minute to highlight a few of the resources on this slide. These are also on the workshop website. So in the For Libraries column, the first resource, the Ready Business Power Outage Toolkit, is from FEMA. And this actually builds on the risk assessment worksheet from the first workshop, where first you identified risks. This one will actually help you take those risks and turn them into actual plans. So that would be a good place to begin. Another kind of good general overview resource is what you need to know about power outages. And I know Tim is going to address a lot of this as well, but just a resource that you can refer back to from the CDC provides a good overview. Drilling down, there are two specific resources about carbon monoxide poisoning and electric safety in generators. And these are more geared toward when you get back into your buildings after an extended power outage. Finally, there's a listing for electric utilities in New York. And then I was also able to find some power outage preparation plans from public and academic libraries. And so those are also the links you see at the very bottom. The resources for communities consist of checklists. The one from CDC and FEMA are just fantastic. Even if you only do a couple of things on those checklists, they're worth your time. The 2-page flyer would be a fantastic handout for your patrons. And I'd also like to call your attention to the disaster planning for individuals with disabilities from FEMA. Those also provide some really great resources. So again, the slideshow is on the website already. The resources are already on the website. And so you can get to those. I'll put the link in the chat. But right now I'd like to turn it over to Tim. So thanks again, Tim Hayes from Central Hudson, for being here today.
Well, thanks a lot, Sarah. And as Sarah mentioned, my name is Tim Hayes, and my title is Senior Director of Emergency Preparedness for Central Hudson Gas and Electric. A little bit about Central Hudson. I know probably most of you are customers of Central Hudson. I think that our territories overlap pretty well. We do cover parts of 8 counties. We have about 300,000 customers, and in electric jargon, that means 300,000 meters, not people. We also have about 80,000 gas customers, and we cover about 2,600 square miles. As far as utilities go, we tend to be rather sparsely populated. We do have cities in Poughkeepsie and Beacon and Kingston and Newburgh, but most of our area is fairly rural by comparison to most other larger utilities. When Sarah and I talked about what will be a good presentation today, we kind of came up with 5 different topics that we'll kind of cover real briefly. How utilities prepare for a major weather event, what types of storms are most likely to cause extended outages. That's in general, not specific for libraries. How can people in general and librarians get help or get information about from utilities? How utilities prioritize restoration. I'm sure that's of interest to a lot of people. And how can you as library directors prepare and help? So we'll try to cover all those different things, but please feel free to interrupt or ask questions through chat if you want me to elaborate anything as we're going through this. When it comes to preparing for any emergency, you may have seen this slide or something similar to it in other presentations that you've seen. Our first step at Central Hudson and all the utilities is to develop a plan, an actual written plan. It's rather detailed. It takes everybody through what their responsibilities are during a storm. After you have a written plan, then you have to do the next 2 steps, which are equip the organization by any necessary tools or any equipment, materials, that type of thing, and train people. And one of the things we'll talk about in just a while is that at Central Hudson, everybody has both the regular job, a blue sky job. They might be accountants or computer programmers or work in our HR department. But when the storm comes, everybody, almost 1,100 of us have a storm responsibility that's totally different. So for many of those positions require special training. So now that we've got some tools set aside, we've got some training done, then we have to practice it. And there's different ways you can practice it. An exercise is a tabletop exercise is one we'll talk about today. And you can, and also an exercise is very similar to what you would do in real life. So either during an exercise or during after a real event. That the final step is to critique how your company or how your organization performed, and do an evaluation. And from that evaluation, you should look for two things. One, did we follow the plan as written? Did people know their responsibilities? Did people act out the responsibilities? Or did they go rogue and do something that they probably shouldn't have? And two, was the plan itself good? So you try to see if people weren't following the plan, then probably more training is necessary. If there's problems with the plan, then it's time to change the plan. And so this keeps going in a continuous cycle after every event and after every exercise and every time something happens. Our plan is pretty detailed. For the electric plan, we have them for gas emergencies as well, but our electric plan is almost 400 pages. Unlike most of the books that you have in your circulation, this one is not considered interesting by very many people at all. Most people don't read the whole thing cover to cover. But they do specialize, or they do focus in on the one or two things that they personally are responsible for. One of the many appendices in the books talks about here's all the storm responsibilities, all the different roles that we have, and the people know what role is theirs. As a matter of fact, when you get hired at Central Hudson, on your first day of work, along with signing all of the income tax documents and being shown where the restrooms are and being given your badge so that you can wear it, you're also told, oh, by the way, here's your storm responsibility, or you will have a storm responsibility. So it's really something that's taken pretty seriously right at the beginning of somebody's employment. Yes, Sarah. You're on mute.
So yeah, I just had a question, like how many people do you have working on developing that plan? Like, is it a team of people from across your organization?
Yeah, we've got a small team of people, probably 2 or 3 people that focus on that have a major focus on that are in my organization. But whenever we make a change, it almost always affects people outside of our organization. So we have to deal with that part of the company as well as we're making the change. A lot of times we change the way we're structured during a storm, and we may change organizational structure. So we have to get in touch with everybody that would be part of that change and get their buy-in.
All right, thank you.
Okay. And I mentioned organizational structure, and I know Sarah mentioned at the beginning that one of the reference materials that you mentioned is from FEMA. Well, FEMA also is the host of this ICS, which is Incident Command Structure, which if you're familiar with any local police department, any fire department, they all follow a very similar organizational structure. And it's been set up like this across the country so that people in emergency response area can speak the same language. When I talk to a fire department, I say, who's your incident commander? That's the person in charge of that particular event. The same is true at Central Hudson. When you say, last Monday, we had a big power outage and we were trying to respond as a whole company, who's the incident commander? We all know in our company who the incident commander is. As for major events, I'm usually the deputy incident commander. For smaller events or when our incident commander is not available, I serve that role at our company. But the whole idea of the organization, ICS, is to have a uniform structure. It's saying the same forms and everything that are used throughout the country in any different emergency situation. It's actually started by the firefighters out in California back in the 70s, and it has grown and been adopted by the federal government. Talked about equipping our own employees and how what things we need. We have boxes that are set up specifically for certain tasks. For instance, during a storm, we'll typically pull out just about all of our electrical engineers and say, okay, you're going to be damage assessors. You're going to get in your cars and you're going to drive out and find out what the problems are before our linemen get there, so that when we send our linemen there, they can have the proper tools, the proper trucks, the proper materials that they need, so they don't do back and forth trips, because the linemen are probably the most scarce resource we have. So we want to make sure their time is used as efficiently as possible. Plus, those damage assessors are sending back lots of information and let us figure out how bad this storm really affected our territory, which is important because customers want to know when their lights are going to be back on. And the real driver behind that is not how many customers are out, it's how many problems we have to fix and how long it's going to take to fix them. So if we go out there and we found a blown fuse that may take 15 minutes to fix, that's a good thing. If we go out there and find 3 broken poles and wires that are laying down in the middle of the field, and it's going through a swamp that's difficult to get to, the same type of outage may take 15 minutes or may take a day and a half to repair. So anytime we can know that information in advance, we want to know that so we can make better estimates. We also have contractors list that we have in advance. We have all sorts of materials stored and just waiting for a storm that we won't touch during regular blue sky operations. We have extra poles laying around, that type of thing, so that we can be prepared when the storm does come. I mentioned training, and we do a lot of in-person training as well as hands-on training for things that are repetitive that we do year after year. We do a lot of online training as well. For instance, if you're a wire guard, you may not do that. You may be an accountant during the day, but we need somebody to stand by a down wire to protect the general public. We'll give you an in-person training and talk it through the process with you at first. After you've done it a couple of times, but you may not have done it in the last 6 months, every year we'll run through another video with you just to update you and refresh you on the process. Other things don't require any training. We have people that deliver food to our crews in the field. That obviously doesn't require any training. Other things, we have people that put up house services, just the wire running from the pole to your house. That is a less requires less training than what the linemen actually have, but it still requires some hands-on training. You actually have to get up on a ladder and know what you're doing. So there's various levels of training that we go through every year. I already mentioned drills and exercises. We by regulation, we have to have at least one major exercise a year. We often have more than that, but our major one probably will have 80 or 90 people involved. It's technically a tabletop exercise because we don't go around and drive trucks out in the field as we're doing it. But we do develop a very detailed scenario that plays out through several days. And we put the people on the spot and we're asking what are known as injects, or questions of those people that are supposed to be surprises, but they're very reminiscent of the type of question or type of decision that somebody would have to make during a regular storm. For instance, we bring in lots of people from the outside to help during a storm. We might ask our person who's in charge of logistics or in charge of housing, you just found out that we're getting 350 people, and it also happens to be graduation weekend for 2 colleges in the area. And you now don't know where you're going to house them because all the hotels that you usually use, you've called up and said are booked. What will you do? Now, if that makes the person's pulse race a little bit, that's good, because that's a real life scenario that the person would have to face during a storm. And believe me, we faced that during a storm. So we try to come up with pictures with questions or injects like that, to try to make everybody in the organization think out of the box a little bit and come up with situations that are not typical or that we've seen in the past, because we have a new person in that role and we want to test a new person with those same situations that we've run across in the past.
Well, so are you going to give us what the answer is?
Well, we've used the college dorms at Marist. We've used the college dorms at Mount St. Mary's in Newburgh. We've also used a campsite that West Point owns. That wasn't a real big favorite for the people that had to stay there because there was bunk beds and not a lot of thickness in the mattresses. Because typically when we bring people in from the outside, we use hotel rooms. And we do the breakfast and dinner right in the same hotel. We deliver their lunch to them in the field, and so they're taken pretty good care of, and they're kind of used to that as some of the linemen do a lot of traveling. We bring in contractors from literally all over North America, And some of these folks do a lot of traveling to storms. So when they have to go from sleeping in a nice hotel to sleeping in bunk beds to 4 to a room, after working in a 33-degree rain all day long, that's not usually something that they look forward to. But there are other situations. We haven't had to do it at our company, where there's vendors out there that will bring in tents and set up tent cities that will basically be completely self-sufficient. They'll have a dining hall, another tent that has just cots and cots and cots laid out. They may have 250 people sleeping in the same tent. Another tent or trailer for shower facilities and bathroom facilities. Another one for the kitchen. They'll have parking attendants out there because you've got to park hundreds of bucket trucks, and that in itself is a real challenge. If you can picture living in a tent city with 500 other people, all of whom are pretty tired and cranky, it's probably not the best situation in the world, but that often happens in other utilities, especially in utilities that don't have a lot of hotel space in their territories.
Well, so thank you. And to bring it back to planning for libraries, and then I'll let you move on. When you ran down the list of dorm rooms and like the campground at West Point, do you do that brainstorming like in the middle of the tabletop exercise, or is that like, do you have that list of assets kind of ready to go?
We have that list of assets ready to go. Okay. That's not to say we don't come up with things at the last minute also, but the ideal situation is to have thought through all of those things in advance. And that's true with any tabletop exercise. A tabletop exercise is designed to bring out the things that you didn't think about in advance, and try to make it so the next time you go through the tabletop exercise, you have it written down in front of you.
Gotcha.
That's
okay.
A very good point.
All right. Thank you.
And this is exactly a good lead in. You're a good straight man, Sarah. After you do that exercise or do a real event, we always sit down as a group, and we do it different ways. We may do a survey. We may do it in focus groups. We may actually put the committees together. There's all sorts of different things we do, but we always try to look for those things like, ooh, that question stumped people. What can we do to make sure that we've smoothed out that in the future? Because if somebody thinks it might happen, it probably will during the next storm. That's kind of what we found. So it's certainly worth going through the whole process. Different storm types. I'll shift gears here a little bit. I'll start with winter, since that's the season that, even though it's 70 out today, we're getting here soon enough. And I asked this question because this may be a different answer for a lot of you than it is for a utility. And which types of winter storms would cause you most heartache? I think a lot of people would jump right towards, oh, blizzard's got to be the worst. For Central Hudson and other utilities, probably not so much. When you have trees that are kind of cemented in the ground because the ground is frozen and there are no leaves on them, a 35-mile-an-hour wind doesn't do a lot of damage. Heavy snow, in order to get heavy snow, it's usually fairly light. When I say heavy snowfall, I mean lots of inches of snow. In order to get lots of inches of snow, it usually has to be fairly light and fluffy. However, if you look at the other end of the spectrum, in the early parts of the fall or the later parts or early parts of the spring, when you have 5 inches of heavy wet snow, that could be devastating. That we could lose 100,000 customers or something like that, especially if it happens while there's still leaves on the trees. And the one there that's kind of blacked out by the truck fender says 22 inches of snow. That almost never causes a problem. If you have a couple feet of snow, in order to get that in this part of New York State, it almost always is going to be lighter than normal. And normal one is kind of like a 10-to-1 ratio of moisture to inches of snow. But in order to get a couple feet of snow, it almost never causes a problem. It's terrible for driving, obviously, so we can't get places, but it doesn't cause enough weight on the tree branches or the wires to cause a problem. The one that really can be devastating, this just happened in Oklahoma 2 weeks ago, is ice. And Oklahoma is still dealing with a major ice storm that they had out there from 2 weeks ago. They still have customers that are still out. So that if you see ice in the forecast and it's more than 1/4 of an inch, you can almost be assured that somebody in our area is going to lose electricity. And if it's a 1/2 inch, it's going to be a high percentage, and there's going to be very long outages, because that ice will build up on the tree branches. The tree branches will break, and when they come down, they'll be very heavy, and they'll break the wires, the poles, and everything else that they hit on the way. So that's one that would definitely keep me up at night. During the spring and the summer, we have thunderstorms. So Hudson Valley has actually quite a few. Florida has the most, so we don't even come anywhere near what they do. But a thunderstorm typically doesn't bring a long-term outage, meaning more than 24 hours. But because they're so frequent, we may 2 or 3 or 4 times a summer get thunderstorms that we have customers out, a smaller number of customers that are out for 24 hours. Tornadoes, we do have them in the Hudson Valley. They're not frequent, but we certainly do have them. We had one, let's see, we had one, I'm trying to remember last time. I believe we had one last year. No, we had one in the spring of this year, spring of 2020. It was actually over in Orange County. But more damaging in this area are microbursts. And the difference between the two are tornado winds kind of go in a curving motion, a circular motion, whereas microbursts, the winds are straight line. But they actually, the National Weather Service will actually send people out in the field and look at what direction the trees have fallen in to make the determination of what type of weather event they've had. And that's why the National Weather Service.
Is that like the derecho that happened in Iowa this summer?
Yeah, a derecho is different than a microburst in that it goes on for a longer period of time. But derechos can be devastating because they do go on for a long period of time. They keep blowing things down, and then they keep blowing more things down. They keep blowing more things down. They can go on for hours, and they're with very high wind levels. 90 miles an hour for a couple of minutes is going to cause power outages, but 90 miles an hour for 4 or 5 hours is going to cause lots of outages. And yeah, there's been derechos. They're more prevalent in the Midwest, but they've come east, and they went through Philadelphia and Washington a couple of years ago. So they could certainly come through here as well, the derecho. In the fall, there's obviously the ones that get all the headlines, which are the hurricanes and tropical storms. Our companies obviously had been affected by several of them. Actually, the one that did the most damage at Central Hudson was Irene back in 2011. It wasn't Sandy, but we've been affected by many of them. Fortunately, where we are, we're a little bit protected because we're a little bit farther away from the coast. And as it comes off the coast, it tends to lose some power as it gets inland, almost definitely. For those of you who just remember suffering through ISIS probably 9 weeks ago, Central Hudson had more than 37 or 38% of our customers that lost electricity during that. Almost all of them were back on within 3 days, and the last 2% were put on the 4th day. Unlike what happened in Long Island and some areas to the south of us, Long Island had people out for over a week for that one. But it was our 4th largest storm in history when measured by the number of customers that were affected. So it was fairly large. As I already mentioned, that there's very few weather events that can blow a wire down or blow a pole over. The problem is almost always related to the strength of the tree branch that's over the top of the wires. And then the tree branch is heavy and it falls, and that has the force to break the wire, pole, or other piece of equipment. Again, snow does not in itself, and even ice. I've seen situations where ice can build up enough on a line that it will break a line, but not in Central Hudson territory. I've been in other parts of the country and seen that. Most of the time, even with an ice storm, the real damage are the trees that are breaking and falling on the lines. Fortunately, we're able to design around those issues, but we can't build the line strong enough to withhold the weight of a tree falling on a pole. Actually, I shouldn't say that's not quite true. If we elected to put up all concrete or steel poles, we could probably design around some of them. There's a real cost, and also there's people that might object to the visual impact that something like that would have. A couple of hazards to the community, obviously they're different than they would be to the utility infrastructure. Freezing temperatures are obviously a huge concern for us if we have a storm in the wintertime. Knowing that the power is out can lead to major problems to people's health, and you know, obviously, especially with senior citizens that are not willing to leave their homes. There have been problems where senior citizens have succumbed to being cold in their homes. Travel conditions are obviously a major issue, as is flooding. Flooding can displace people, and it can also cause physical damage to everybody's homes and businesses. So those are all issues that we have to be aware of as well, even though they may not have as direct impact on the utilities facilities. Talk a little about communications. I know I'm running over time here. Central Hudson and all the other utilities in the area use many different forms to communicate with the public. And we try to hit all the forms that people might be interested in hearing. A lot of people tend to like the older ways of getting their information through news broadcasts or newspapers or things like that, but just as many follow us on social media. It's something that utilities have had to get used to, just like everybody else. We also do very organized types of communication with different groups of people through conference calls and reports that are given out to the various organizations. One of the newer things and things that's growing in popularity is automated texting. Anybody can sign up, whether you're for your home or even for your library if you wanted to, just by entering your account number, and get an automatic text when Central Hudson believes there's an outage at your location. We will also text you back when we think we have an estimated restoration time for your location. And if that changes, which sometimes it does, we will text you again and say, oh, by the way, we told you 2 o'clock, it's really going to be 4 o'clock. You'll get another text for that. And then at the end, after your power's been restored, we'll text you again to say, hey, the power has been restored at your location. And if it's still out, it means our records are not quite right. And we'd appreciate it if you let us know that by texting out back to us. So it's a two-way process, and it brings a lot of information. And it's pretty valuable for a lot of folks because, A, if you're at work and you want to know what's happening with your home, you can set it up so you're getting information about your home while you're at work, or vice versa. You can set it up about your business while you're at home. And a lot of people like to check on their elderly parents or grandparents and set it up for their elderly parents or house. So this is all automated processes that take place that you can sign up for. We also have an app. Central Hudson has an app which has a nice little map on it. You can go to our website and get the same map, and we'll show you where all the outages are in the area. And if there is an estimated time of restoration, that's also available there. So anyway, if you look at these, we certainly try to communicate in many different ways. So it's one of the things that I think that your area of responsibility in a community can really help with, is just to get the word out that we should be accessible. I talked about professional communications versus public communications. This is just some more of this, the same way to break it up. We prior to an event, we talk to a lot of our different customer groups. For instance, our life support equipment customers. If we know that you've signed up because you have equipment in your house that runs on electricity that you need to help support you, we have a process where we'll notify you in advance that we think there's a storm coming and that you could lose power. We will also check on you. If you do lose power, we'll call you at your home, make sure you're okay. And if we can't get a hold of you, we actually send somebody out to knock on your door. So that's just one of the things that we do for our life support customers. We do something similar, but a little less extensive with our people that are elderly, blind, or disabled. And then of course there's other types of communication we do with other emergency responders in the area, or other groups that help out with emergency response. Move on to the fourth topic here real quickly. When it comes to prioritizing our efforts after a storm does hit, first and foremost is safety, both of the community and of our employees. So we get out there as quickly as possible. And during IESIS, for instance, we had nearly 2,600 reports of downed wires. That's far more employees than we have. So we can't get there and look at everyone instantly, but we do prioritize them, the ones that we think would cause the most problems, and get people out there as quickly as possible. At first to just stand by them, and then to get a crew there to fix them. Then we have to start getting into how are we going to restore the customers. And the first block is transmission. Those are the big lines that you see running through the fields on the big towers, because those usually affect very large groups of customers. Those are almost always the first things we attack. So a lot of times you may not see trucks out on the road because they're going to be back in the fields fixing those big things first. Then we got to kind of go to large blocks of customers where you might have 1,500 customers out because of one problem. Often when you have 1,500 customers out, that includes things like traffic signals. It may also include other things like hospitals and other critical facilities. And then we go to critical facilities. And we actually have 3 different levels, and these are provided by the state. They're not really something that we have a lot of control over. But obviously hospitals and medical facilities, airports, water and wastewater, that's sewer facilities, the police and fire department, shelters. And if any libraries are shelters, then obviously you would be considered a critical facility, and we would prioritize the restoration to your facility, especially if it was going to be opened in a particular event, if we knew it was going to be open. Mass transit, we don't necessarily supply the electricity that runs the trains, Metro North and things like that, but we do have train stations in our service territory. Military bases, which also in our case overlaps with airports, because Stewart is both a military base and an airport, and flood control structures. Nursing homes, other government buildings, prisons, they're all in our level 2 category. And if you think of high-rise buildings, fortunately in the Hudson Valley we have very few. But if you think about it, if you had some elderly people in a 15th floor of an apartment building, and the air conditioner goes out and they can't get down through the elevator, that becomes a very serious situation in a real hurry. So that's obviously a situation we have to deal with. Probably the most interesting one that is a critical facility are the big box stores, Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, all those, and simply because people need the things in those stores to kind of get life back to normal when their power does go out. Whether it's blue tarps or plywood for their windows, or getting cleaning supplies, or even food, they need those facilities. So they're actually rise to the level of a critical facility. I already talked about life support customers, so I'll move on beyond that one. So let me get on to what a librarian can do, or a library director can do. First of all, share knowledge with the public. We try our best. I showed you the slide with all the different ways we communicate. We try our best. But if you can get out the different ways that you can contact Central Hudson, whether it's through our website, our app, by signing up for texting, automated texting, by calling us. If you call us, most likely during a storm, the first thing you'll come into is our phone tree. So you'll be talking to a phone system, and most people end up actually reporting their outage that way. But if you hold on the line, you can talk to an actual person. It's just that obviously they're very busy during the storm. You can develop an emergency plan for your own facility. And I know Sarah's done a wonderful job of getting out some pretty good templates to use, the things to consider. The things that I would add to that are think about the building itself that you're in, and what situations what is unique about your building that you have to be aware of. Do you have facilities, for instance, that are in a basement where if you lose power, you lose lights, or you have maybe only emergency lighting or something that's, how would you get people out of that if the power went out and they physically couldn't see? Do you have an elevator in your building? Is it powered by an emergency generator? Could you have somebody trapped in the elevator? All these things are the first, right off the bat, what types of things do you have to be considerate? Do you have to consider? Are you open during evening hours this time of year when it would go dark everywhere in your building? What kind of lights would you have? And how would you respond to help get people out safely? So you really have to know your facility to know that. I'm sure that some of you are in buildings that have backup generators, others are not. So that's one thing you have to know. And also that's the first step. And the second step is, okay, suppose it's going to be a long-term outage. Do you have any things that you have to do to prepare for a long-term outage? Say you think that you might be out for 2 or 3 days. Are there any things? Do you have a refrigerator in a break room someplace that's going to go bad? I mean, all those things, same things you think about at home. And I already talked about where to get information. And the last thing I'll talk about is what to do about an unusual situation. Say you're in your building and your lights go dim, not go out, but go dim. Is there anything you can do? And I would say one thing you have to consider when your lights go dim is it's making your appliances work differently than they were designed. The ones that are most susceptible to failure is anything with a motor in it. And that could be your heating system, your air conditioner, a refrigerator. If you've got fans, if you've got a dehumidifier, all those things could be damaged if you've got dim or partial lights. So those are things you want to get turned off to protect the appliance itself. Same is true at home, obviously. Because they're going to run slowly, and if a motor runs slowly, it is slowly burning itself up. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing, partial lights, depending on how your building is wired and how we supply it, there's also a real possibility that you could have lights in part of your building, but not the whole thing. And how would you react that way? What would your response be that way? That's probably less of a problem from a damage to equipment standpoint, unless you happen to be served by what's called a 3-phase service, and you have large 3-phase equipment in the building. I'm sure if you're in a building that, let's say it's in a hospital, all hospitals are 3-phase. There's a possibility that you could have some 3-phase equipment in your library. And that's something you have to understand before the emergency situation occurs, so you know how to react. And you also know who to ask for help. Make sure you have a very good list and you know where it is. Here's the people I have to call. It could be somebody as simple as the maintenance person for your facility. You may also want to have the numbers of an electrician or a plumber or something like that on hand, and know that in advance. So that's not something that you have to deal with in the middle of an emergency. But anyway, I think I've gotten through all my formal slides, and I'm sure I'm way over time. But
you're actually right on time, and I have a couple of questions for you, but I'll also open it up if people want to start throwing questions into the chat, and we can get started that way. And I was keeping myself on mute because the lawn service came next door to my neighbors right when you started. So, so thank you for this, Tim. I'll just start with a question that somebody popped into the chat early on, and it was a comment, and it's something that it picks up on your talking about the list of critical facilities. So Tom says it's critical that when there's an extended and widespread outage, that libraries have worked with the local EMS people to get libraries near the top of the list for restoration. So this aids in providing people with a resource for heating, cooling, and with device charging. And I guess, the question is, how do we get on this list?
Well, as I mentioned, the list, those categories that I showed you are kind of regulated by the state. If you're a recognized shelter facility, then you're already on the list, or we will treat you like we're on the list. I cannot. No utility can go in and just say libraries are important, so we have to add you to the list. Unfortunately, that's not within our authority to do. However, fortunately, I will say that most libraries that I'm aware of anyway tend to be closer to a village center or a city center, for that reason, one of the things that we do, it's physics. We restore the large groups of customers first, and where the large groups of customers are is where it's more densely populated. So therefore, we're going to go to the areas where there's more dense population, and that's typically where you're going to find a library. So by default, libraries are going to be restored considerably more quickly than individual residential customers that are out in a more rural area. I personally, I'm talking to you from a dirt road in the middle of northern Dutchess, not near any village or city center. So my personal residence would be one of the last to get restored, and typically is. Not because of me, but just because of my location and the population density here. Whereas the libraries that are closest to me are right in the center of the villages, or not all of them, but a lot of them are in a more densely populated area than where I live.
Right. Good point. Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Brian, who wants to know, is there a reason why we don't do underground lines?
Well, I'll answer that a couple ways. Any new residential development that's over 5 homes, we do underground lines. And that's also a state mandate. There are exceptions to that if you happen to build on solid rock or something like that, where it's not really feasible to do it. Then you're still allowed to put poles in the ground and go overhead. Now, about replacing major existing roadwork underground, the real cost is not the cost of the wire, it's the cost of restoring what's already there. So if you're digging up streets and digging up people's driveways, there's a tremendous cost to that. I don't have an actual average cost of overhead versus underground, but there's magnitudes difference in the cost of installing it in a developed area. When you're starting with a brand new plot of land in a farmer's field and you're putting in a housing development, it's much more economical in a situation like that to put it underground than it would be to try doing something along Route 9 where it's all paved and you've got to dig it up and you've got to repave it when you're done. There's also different types of underground systems. The ones that go into residential developments are usually a wire buried in the ground, literally buried right in the dirt. Whereas if you're dealing with a city structure, like we have in the city of Poughkeepsie or Newburgh, or even a little bit in Kingston, where we have manhole systems and ductwork running between those manhole systems and different equipment in those manholes to automatically switch things to make it more reliable, like it should be. That is infinitely more expensive than putting a piece of wire directly into the dirt. So in general, the simple answer is cost. I can also throw in a couple other operational reasons why it's not quite as appealing as it would look. When there is a problem with an overhead line, you can ride down the road and you can see it. When there's a problem with an underground line, you can't. And the act of restoring something underground takes a lot longer and is a lot more costly than restoring something above ground. So there are some cons to underground. So it really has to be done with really an overall picture of what you're gaining by doing it versus the cost you're spending to do it.
Well, so thank you for the detailed answer. I guess I'd always kind of wondered that myself, but yeah, thank you. So I wanted to flip back to kind of maybe a practical question. So let's say there's an extended electrical outage, and it was really useful to hear you talk about, like, what do you do when your lights are dim, or if there's a partial outage. But let's say there's an extended outage for a couple of days, and libraries have to shut their buildings down. Do you have some tips or reminders that people should think of as they're coming back into their buildings? I guess the first part would be, like, if you're leaving, it's going to be for a couple of days and the power is out, what should you do? And then what should you do to kind of turn things back on?
Well, first of all, if it's wintertime, the biggest concern around here is, are your pipes going to freeze? And depending on the type of heat, that could be both your regular water supply to your sinks and toilets and all that kind of stuff, but it could also be your heating system. So those are the two things that you have to be most worried about in the wintertime. Typically, you're not going to be out long enough that you have to be concerned about that. But if it was bitter cold in the middle of January, that is something you have to be concerned about. And getting those pipes shut off at very least and drained if possible are things you might want to consider. And again, that is going to be building specific. Whether it depends how if your whole building is the whole library and you're standalone and you've got exterior walls that you've got piping in, and they're old and not very well insulated, that's one thing you have to be concerned about. If you're part of another larger building and you're kind of insulated by the building around you, it's going to take a lot longer for your building to drop down to a situation weather-wise where you have to worry about it. So that's one thing that I would be very concerned about if I knew my facility was going to be in the dark for several days. Coming back to your building, in all likelihood, you're going to come back and the power is going to be back on again. So everything hopefully will be just as it was when you left. However, depending on how it went out, a lot of times there's different situations where our equipment operates. Will turn off your electricity and turn it back on, and turn it off and turn it back on automatically. I'm sure you've all experienced blinking lights at one time or another, then they finally go off. That's our system working the way it was designed. However, it's really when lights come back on or electricity comes back on, there's always a surge of electricity as it comes in, and it doesn't typically happen, but it can always cause a problem with electronic equipment. So I would anything that's computerized, I would go around and just check to make sure it's still functioning the way you think it should be working when you come back in. It's very doubtful it's going to blow your light bulbs or anything like that, but it certainly could have some. I've heard of people that had like a phone system, and they came back and their phone system was shot when they came back in. And that's obviously something you'd want to check when you walk back in your building. If you have a phone system, that you want to make sure that it's still functioning the way you think it should. So I would look at those things. And there's also a possibility when the electricity comes back on, whether it's blinking on and off or just it went off once and we turned it back on 2 days later, that you could have a surge of electricity on your end that trips your own circuit breakers. So make sure you know where the circuit breakers are in your library. And if there's still some things that are out in your library, other things are on, you say that's weird. More than likely, there's a circuit breaker that popped when the electricity came back on.
Okay, great, thank you. So also checking the chat. Okay, so a couple of more questions came in. So Carolyn would like to know, are there any situations where you would restore rural areas before a city center?
Yes, and I'll give you a very, very recent example. Everybody knows last Monday was very breezy around here, and last Tuesday was election day. And the state had provided Central Hudson with a list of all the polling places in the Hudson Valley. And on Monday, we made a distinct effort to get out to the polling places as quickly as possible to make sure to aid, because it was a day before, to give confidence to the people that had to be there the next day that their site would be on and be available at 6 o'clock in the morning when they open their doors for voting. In that situation, very definitely we made a very distinct attempt, and a lot of the polling places are not necessarily in very populated areas. They tend to be in churches, basements, and town halls. Town halls are in the city center, but not all churches are. Other situations could be, there's dairy farms. There's not a lot left in the Hudson Valley, and most really large ones have backup generation. But if a dairy farm were to go out, and say they called up and said, you know, we've got 100 head of cattle and had 100 head of cows, and we just lost our generator. If you don't get there within a certain amount of time so they can get their milkers going again, they could lose their livelihood, because the cows will lose the ability to milk, obviously, and then they have to have calves before they can start it again, so they're out of business. So something like that, we would certainly take something like that into consideration as well.
Thank you. Excellent question, Carolyn. So we're coming up on the end of the hour, and I'm not seeing many questions. Why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll just highlight a couple of things for people. But if you keep thinking of questions, please do send them in. I just want to send a reminder that the Disaster Planning Working Group is meeting next Tuesday. And I've put the end of workshop survey into the chat, and I will do that again. So on your way out, if you could take a minute to give some feedback, that would be great. The slides are already posted. And again, the one thing I wanted to highlight, and Tim brought this up in his presentation with the incident command structure. And that's covered in this disaster information specialization course. And maybe after I'm done with the run through, Tim could come back and just say a couple more words about that, because our first speaker also highlighted in terms of libraries being resilient and just kind of ready for an emergency or disaster, knowing how to speak the language of the people who are there to help you is pretty useful. So again, if you take the free disaster information specialization course, you cover that command system and the language that's used. So please get in touch if you're interested in learning more about that course, or you can find out about it on the website. So I think we'll conclude the presentation right there. I just want to say thank you again to Tim. If you want to hang out for a minute and talk about the incident command system, I would like to hear that. And just again, thank you everybody for showing up today to talk about this really important topic. So I'm going to stop recording and okay.